All right, so the user model is going to be more or less our source of truth for a tenant and the subdomain they're affiliated with. So when a user creates their new account, they need to be associated with that subdomain field we've added. The way to scope it with Devise is to actually use a few tweaks in bells and whistles to make that happen. So we need to actually backtrack a few things that have already been installed. So the validatable is going to be one of those. We actually want to remove this completely. And then we want to actually use request keys here. And then we're going to source our subdomain through that. So this is going to, basically the concept here is to allow the user to scope their credentials to other domains, as well as make it more approachable for people who want to sign up given their own domain, and then also persist their login across the domain. So it's kind of a confusing and crazy concept, but it does end up working pretty well. So we need to do a few things when a new user is created though. So if you've created a user already, probably just hold off if I were you, but if you have already, it's not going to have any of this associated with it. So it's just kind of one of those dark areas that's going to be persistent until we get the model in order. So we can do some fancy stuff with Rails where you can do things after a model is created or deleted. Here we're going to do one called create tenant. And then we'll have one that says after destroy, we'll say delete tenant. So we shouldn't have a tenant after they deleted their account, right? That makes sense to me. Okay, so one thing I want to do is validate the email. This is just a small enhancement here. It's just saying it's unique when a user signs up. And you'll see why that we have to run a migration here to change a few things in our Devise schema. So let's first create these methods and then we'll go back and do that. Create tenant. And this will hook into apartment and then the tenant class, and then go to the create method, and then we'll pass in the subdomain created. If I can spell domain. Okay, so that's that one. Delete is very similar. Apartment, tenant, drop, subdomain. And then there's this fancy one from Devise where we need to kind of make sure there's conditions on the login once it's scoped to the subdomain. So it's a little fancy, and I actually pulled this from the Devise README, but we're basically doing this find or authentication, warden conditions. This is a little over my head, to be honest, but it's something that needs to happen. So say where email, warden conditions, then we'll pass in email, and then subdomain, warden conditions, subdomain, and then we'll call the first one. Cool. So hopefully that works. In the documents, or README, should say, you might see it written like this, and that's just an older way to write the same thing. So I prefer the non-hash rocket approach personally. Just looks cleaner. Okay, so with that, we still needed to run that migration I mentioned. So let's get Devise to work with us here. Okay, so the migration is going to look like this, and then we're still going to have to tweak a lot of other stuff too. So I'm going to go in a new tab, zoom in on this for you, webcrunch. We'll go to workout tracker. There we go. And we'll run our migration. So I want to call this Rails generate migration reindex users by email and subdomain. So by default, it is just the email, I believe. So we'll run this and we'll do our own. Oh, I didn't mean to delete that. Let's say Rails should be G, not D. There we go. I don't think there was anything to delete there by default, so I think we're safe. So we'll go into the database, go and hit that migration. It's going to look like this. We want to actually go old school and do a def up and a def down. And with that, we'll remove index users from the users table and email. And we'll add an index. Email subdomain. And we want those to be unique from the data side. So we've got that validation already in that place, but this is making sure it's super validated. And then we'll just kind of undo that in the down statement. So you're just basically swapping things here. So we'll say users and then email. And then add index, users, email, unique, unique, true. So this is because if you were to scaffold your own user authentication system, it would be different here, but devise comes by default, scoping it to the email and adding an index on that by default. But we want to add a additional scope of subdomain and make them unique per user. All right, so that's kind of complicated, but it ends up making this work. So I'm all cool with that. So then we'll just do Rails DB migrate. So we keep getting this message, but we did get our actual migration invoked, so that's good. So we don't have any tenants yet, so that's one thing. So we need to actually create an account. But before we do that, I want to modify a few things to make this still work. So our routes need to be updated too, and basically when a user signs up, I want them to be redirected to their subdomain that they chose. And to do that, we need a few constraints in the routes directly. So let's go to config routes, and by default we have devise and our route to home index, which is good. I'm going to delete this comment. But we want to do a bit different with the routes by default, and you can actually append a class to this, and I'll probably reference my other app just so I don't mess this up royally. But our general concept is to generate this class and then do a resources on the eventual workouts model that we'll have. So we might need to generate that, to be honest, in this video. So let's maybe get rolling with our regular app. So we want to have this class here, and you can make this live elsewhere if you want to. There is a folder called lib, and if you added a folder here called constraints, which is what this is going to be, Rails will be smart enough to know that that's there, but you do have to import it or require it just like this. It's just an extra thing. Not necessarily important that you do that, but it is something to keep in mind. So that's going to end up looking like constraints subdomain. So we're just hooking into that class. Subdomain do block. And then eventually this will be our resources workouts. Great. So yeah, we want to make sure the workouts and exercises are scoped to the subdomain, because that wouldn't make sense otherwise. Within this class, you can call which requests you don't want to permit. So by default, we want to make sure www isn't, and admins. You could save whatever subdomains you don't want the user to actually visit and be able to visit. So here's how you exclude those. But we still do need to exclude it locally. So the issue that we're running into is for localhost users, you need to still scope to have a root path to the app if you want it. So say on our app, let me pull up the browser. Right now it's localhost. Well, we need to actually make use of the lvhme.me root path now. And so we can access that. But I want to reserve this. I don't want anyone to take this up or use www. And that's already configured in our initializer. So what you can do is have a subdomain exclusion. And the way I did it in our demo project is I created a folder that's called apartment. And then within that is this file plus the subdomain exclusion. So initializers, apartment, our apartment file, and then subdomain exclusion. So I might do that in this one just to keep it consistent. So I'm going to create a new folder, apartment, and we'll move this file into apartment. So I'll move and we'll just say apartment. So that's in there now. And this other file we'll need to actually create. It's going to be subdomain exclusions. I can spell it. I really can't spell it. EXCLUSIONS-RB. In that file, we will have, I'm going to make sure there's not any more than what I'm thinking. Yeah, it's just that one line. It will be apartment, the class of elevators, subdomain dot excluded, subdomains equals. So that's the one, the root one we want to actually keep for ourselves. That's what that's saying. So no one can sign up with that. So now we can go and essentially scaffold that workouts model. But one more thing for devise that's a kind of a gotcha that screwed me royally is one more file that doesn't exist here. We'll create in the initializers and call it session store. So this acts as a way to restore or keep your session through switching the subdomain. So it's something to keep in mind. So it generates a cookie in essence in your browser. So your session is configured to use the lvh.me instance of the subdomain. It permits that. So Rails application .config.session store. And then we'll do cookie store key, and this will be basically pertaining to the name of your app. So I'll just do workout tracker session, and then domain, we'll scope it to our lvh.me for now. Great. Okay, so I know this is confusing, but that's just these steps to make devise play nice with a subdomain based environment, which is a little confusing to make work. So to get this constraint to not error out, let's generate our workouts controller and models and views and stuff next. So I will do that now. And we're going to have just a few columns on it. So I'm going to use a scaffold just for example purposes. So Rails generate scaffold workout. We'll have a title of string. And again, you could just pass title and it'll default to string. I like to just be explicit. And then a date for the workout, and then we'll do date time for the type. So we'll run that. It will generate tons of files, tests, and stuff like that. I want to definitely delete the scaffold CSS it generated. So get rid of that. Cool. And now we can have our resources here. It already threw it in the file up here. I'm gonna just move it. So I'll save that, and we should have access to those now through the subdomain that we persist. There's more to do for the user model. We've already done the migration we needed. We did the model configuration, and then we also need to do some application controller specific stuff. So on our app, we need a few more methods to do a few things. So I'm going to make a private space, and I'm going to go to our final application controller for reference here real quick. All right, so I'm going to have a method called redirect to the subdomain. So I'm going to put this after this, and it's going to be a before action. And we're going to do a redirect with this method. So we're going to say def redirect. We're going to call it what we just called it. And we'll end it. And then inside that, we'll return if self is a devise controller. It's basically anything to do with devise here. It's a nice little hack to get in, and you got to spell it right though. And then we'll do another if current user present. So this, the current user is there, and the request subdomain. That's how you can hook into the actual request, or essentially the URL is not equal to the current user subdomain. And we'll need another end, and then inside that we'll redirect finally to workouts URL, which will be their main space for creating workouts. And we'll pass in the parameter of subdomain from the user itself, like so. So that's confusing as hell, I know, but basically it hooks into the controller, makes sure it's a devise one, checks if the user is there, and then the request, they basically have a subdomain and it's not equal to their subdomain. If it is, then we'll redirect them to their subdomain with their workouts path. So it'll be basically like workouts like that on the URL, but with their subdomain as the prefix to the main domain. On top of that, I want the user to, after sign in, this is part of devise. Then we could do resource. I'm going to call it this, resource or scope in that. And then within that, we'll just put root URL and then subdomain resource or scope subdomain. So if they've already registered and they just sign in on their subdomain, they'll be redirected to their subdomain. As simple as that. I think that's it for that controller. One gotcha though. I'm gonna see if it works. It's different on this machine, but we'll see. I'm gonna do Rails server and try to create an account finally. Looks like we're already running. I might reboot and go. Let's create an account. I need to migrate though. Okay, and this will go away once we finally create a user, so I'll do that. First I need to run server again. Refresh. Redirect to subdomain. Ah, I can't spell. Subdomain. All right. Cool. All right, let's sign up. Hopefully this works, guys. I didn't test it yet. So, okay, we got something up. Create tenant. Did you make create tenant? Looks like our user model might be a little messed up. Let's go check that out. Create tenant. Can't spell. Boy, what I could do if I could spell. All right, let's reboot just because and try that again. I don't think the user would save at that point, so let's try with the same stuff. Hey, it works. Cool. So use all that junk we just did made us redirect to our actual scope of the app. We have to use LVH.me because we're local. A production app, you can, establish those subdomains on your own. You'd probably have to hook into some DNS fanciness to do so, but it is possible. It's beyond the scope of this tutorial, but it's just kind of just showing you where you can at least get started with this stuff. So with that, I think it's a good stopping point for this video because we've officially created a user. We've got the user and we're updating it with all this stuff that we have on them. Now that the apartment gym is installed, we should have now a database for webcrunch. Yeah, there we go. Very cool. So that's all looking good. And I think in the next few videos, we'll work out the controllers for the workouts. Then we'll generate the exercises and then get into some of the Vue stuff. So we'll see you in the very next video.